All right, a special Monday night game before the NFL takes over Monday night. Florida State coming off a 10-3 campaign. Ole Miss breaking into the elite of college football just in the last few seasons, winning a Sugar Bowl in a 10-win season for the Rebels, as well as they finished in the top 10, going at it in Orlando, Mike.
Yeah, and this, in my opinion, is the best football game of the weekend. There are a lot of big-time matchups highlighting the slate, but when you get to this game on Monday night, I mean, it's the last game of the weekend for a reason. I think when looking at Ole Miss and Florida State, Ole Miss has had all the offseason distractions, and that's something that has kind of been in the news. It's been swirling around, all the issues that they had post-Laramie Tunsil there at the draft, and, their recruiting investigation is going on now, and all the violations that may have taken place. It's an interesting situation at Ole Miss right now, but they have a quarterback in Chad Kelly who can take a game over. And in the SEC, you don't have many quarterbacks like that. Chad Kelly's one of the few, and he's a guy that I think is the de facto difference maker in this game, because when pitting him against a freshman quarterback in DeAndre Francois of Florida State, who, I mean, everybody's expecting him to be a pretty solid guy. I mean, Jimbo Fisher just this past week kind of alluded to some of the throws he's making in practice, saying they reminded him of a Heisman Trophy winning quarterback from a couple of years ago, Jameis Winston. So if DeAndre Francois comes out and plays as well as he's done in practice, which, it's an entirely different task when you're going up in week one against an SEC caliber defense, obviously, in Ole Miss. Those are two completely different things. But if DeAndre Francois plays well, I mean, I think that's the ultimate key to this football game. I think when looking at the rest of the roster, obviously Florida State's got Dalvin Cook, very good running back. I really think that he's a guy who can carry that offense at times, but let's face it, right now, I mean, if Ole Miss's defense is able to stop Dalvin Cook or at least slow him down and contain him just enough, and they're going to try to force DeAndre Francois to beat him with his arm, and whether or not he can do that is going to go a long way in determining who wins this football game.
Yeah, so you mentioned Chad Kelly. The situation with Chad Kelly is he carries this offense, 4,000 yards, 31 touchdowns, 10 rushing touchdowns. Ole Miss has almost made it to Atlanta in the SEC championship game, has actually defeated Alabama the past 2 years, almost getting to Atlanta. And probably the reason they didn't is the lack of a solid, strong running game from the running backs. Kelly takes on too much punishment himself in running the football. Jordan Wilkins, their top returning rusher, ineligible as of about 2 weeks ago when he was not enrolled in classes early enough. So they didn't meet the deadline. He's ineligible for this year. Akeem Judd comes back. He's got experience from last year, and Ole Miss fans are really intrigued by Eric Swinney. He's a redshirt freshman out of Atlanta. He was injured last year, but he's a four-star recruit who can make big plays. He's got that kind of ability even at this level, and they're interested in seeing him. That Florida State front seven is always exceptional, always one of the better units in college football, and I'm interested to see the effectiveness of Tunsil's replacement. So Ole Miss going back to the well of the top recruit at left tackle in all of high school football, coming into the collegiate ranks, and Greg Little. But is he ready as a true freshman starting against that Florida State front four on a Monday night with the eyes of the nation watching him as a left tackle? Boy, and Ole Miss starting four new offensive linemen. Chad Kelly is a great quarterback. I don't know if he can handle all of that. Demoria Stringfellow with Laquan Treadwell moving on to the Minnesota Vikings, the number one receiving threat at wideout for Ole Miss. Evan Ingram, he's now a senior at Ole Miss, one of the very best tight ends, receiving tight ends in college football, has to have a big night for Ole Miss to score some points against this Florida State defense.
Yeah, I mean, with Florida State, and like you just spoke to a little bit there, Florida State's front four, they got Josh Sweat there. He's a guy coming into his sophomore year, was one of the more highly recruited defensive ends in the entire country. But from my neck of the woods in Virginia, he was one of the top players in the state when he graduated high school 2 years ago. The guy kind of got his feet wet last year, but he's really going to step into more of a full-time role, defensive end this year. And that matchup you just alluded to there with the offensive line and of course, Josh Sweat, who's going to swap around and kind of play both sides of the line there. Sweat can put a lot of pressure on you. He's a guy that's very good against the run, but he's even more lethal against the pass. I think he's going to be unleashed a little bit more this year than he had last year when he was a freshman. Florida State's front four is really good. The back end of their secondary, obviously, Derwin James leads the way. They got Trey Marshall, of course, as well. it's a very good unit. Florida State's defense is, and it was young last year, but I think it's a unit that's ready to make the next step. And Florida State's defense is really going to have to be as good as advertised if they want to, compete for a college football playoff spot and potentially win the Atlantic Division with that huge matchup against Clemson there in October. It's going to be really interesting. It's going to be really interesting to see how Florida State copes with this huge matchup here right off the bat against Ole Miss. But like you alluded to before, I think Florida State's defense, they can put a lot of pressure on you, especially in the front seven there. If they're able to do that against an inexperienced offensive line there with Ole Miss, I think Florida State will be in good shape. But if they have trouble getting pressure on Chad Kelly, I mean, he's a guy that can take the game over. And I think he'll have Ole Miss right in until the end if he's able to sit back there and throw the ball comfortably all night.
So I guess the Rebels are going to load up against the run against Dalvin Cook and force Florida State to throw the ball downfield. Defensive tackle Isaac Gross, he missed all of 2015, but he was one of the better players at his position for Ole Miss in 2014. So he's back this season. Junior defensive end Marquise Haynes, coming off a 10-sack season for Ole Miss, obviously brings the heat off the edge. Interesting situation at linebacker for Ole Miss, and we're talking about a defense that has been in the top 10. I don't know what the statistics say, but they have been a top 10 defense in the nation the last 2 years. But at linebacker, they've been very thin, and they even lost what they had there. And one of the kids was Denzel Kimdichie, actually Robert Kimdichie's brother, who was their leader on defense at linebacker. So they bring in a transfer from Oregon State, Ramel Maggio, who had 87 tackles to lead Oregon State. Also a huge JUCO star in Dietrich Bing-Jukes coming in as well. DeMarcus Gates was their leading tackler, and he's back at outside linebacker with 76 tackles. Tony Connor, folks, he's a guy to look out for. He could have been a first-round selection in the 2014 draft. He decided to come back, really injury-plagued in 15, and so he got a red shirt and is playing here in 2016 for Ole Miss, suiting up in game one against Florida State. And what, Mike, I got to agree with you. A lot of hype surrounds Alabama, USC, and some of the other matchups. But for me, if I could only watch one game, I'm very intrigued to see Florida State and Ole Miss matchup on Monday night.
Yeah, a lot of good games this weekend, but I think this Ole Miss-Florida State game probably takes the cake. I mean, they're putting this in prime time on Monday night for a reason, and hopefully it lives up to the hype that it's getting right now.
All right, it's the ACC against the SEC on opening weekend. Clemson, Auburn, North Carolina, Georgia, and this one we just wrapped up. The Seminoles taking on the Rebels in Orlando. Mike McDaniel from inside the ACC helping us break it down. Thanks, Mike.
All right, thank you, Mark.